today in this lecture I am going to talk about key terms and concepts in kinship studies. Just to remind you, in the previous lecture I tried to explain kind of a brief background to the emergence of kinship studies in anthropology, how it terms of emerged from anthropological approaches to biology, descent, blood, to understanding of culture, and then to relatedness. And this is the second lecture in the series on kinship studies, and today we will look into some of the key terms and concepts. So just to kind of a caution, these are only some of the key terms, and there are many more, and a more wide kind of a discussion on each of these terms which can go, but I will just briefly look into the terms which will help us to understand the nature of kinship studies in a more detailed manner. So with this we begin to and kind of feedback, or in terms of trying to remind what we did in the previous study, we try to understand what is kinship study. And as we know that kinship is kind of an understanding of the relations between the blood ties and the marital relations, but then kind of a improvement in the field of kinship studies, and today we understand it in terms of the not only being relevant to the domestic domain but also understanding social, economic and religious life of different culture. And with this we try to understand that we need to understand or recognize the relations between parents, children, which is not the same as physical relation or may not coincide with this. So many a time in anthropology there is a kind of a distinction made between the social and the biological, for we have different terms. We have genitor, which means a biological father, and pater, which is a social father. So especially in the case of an adopted child, the child will have a kind of a pater and not necessarily a genitor. So it's very important to be very clear, have a conceptual clarity on some of the terms which in kinship, which will help us to understand relevance of kinship studies, and in a way it makes us a little different from commonsensical or layman understanding of family and marriage. So we try to understand that earlier we had a method called comparative method. Comparative method was central in the time when kinship as a discipline was evolving, coming in from Malinowski to Ratcliffe Brown to Evans Pritchard. The basic method was to compare to society and therefore come out at these differences and similarity, which helped us at a level that helped them, these anthropologists, to arrive at a generalization of them. So comparing the two cultures would help us to understand what was found in one need not necessarily be found in other, or certain uniform pattern which was found across the culture. So first very important thing in kinship study is, especially going back to the biological model, or where the emphasis was on descent, blood, genetic ties, we see that there is a lot of kind of abbreviation which is used in kinship, and that it becomes very relevant when we need to kind of understand the genealogical chart. To make sense of that chart, there are certain abbreviations which are used. For instance, a capital F is father, a capital M is mother, capital S stands for son, D for daughter, FZ, which is a capital F and a Z, is for father's sister. And similarly, capital M and a capital B is MB is mother's brother. So we can also add on kind MBD is mother's brother's daughter, and FZD is father's sister's daughter. So we've heard in cross cousin marriage that a person marries the MBD or FZD, and it might appear as a kind of a puzzle, but if we know the abbreviation of it, it becomes more clear. So similarly, there are other abbreviation, W for wife, H for husband, SP for spouse. But these are the later ones are of less significance. The most significant are the first ones. So we have sibling, GP for grandparents, and GC for grandchildren. These genealogical abbreviations are required when trying to understand the relations between, say, father and father's son or father's father in a genealogical chart. We see many a time we get to draw a genealogical chart in which we represent a descent or line of blood, and there only the abbreviations are used in order to make the chart a little clear and not very confusing. So that is the relevance of genealogical abbreviation. In kinship studies, again, diagrams are very important, and in diagrams we have a circle which stands for a female and a triangle stands for a male. When these circle and triangles are cut across, it implies a deceased or a dead member, and similarly, which is very important to trace the relation between the person and whether it be a circle or a triangle, we also try to use a equal to sign or a line which goes from down upward. So it will show you that there is a relation of marriage between the two person, and a sibling relation is a downward line which is drawn. A straight line stands for descent. See, these diagrams again will help us to understand the relations, or how diagrams depicts the entire web of relation in a very neat chart. So when we look at one individual uses the informant, which in kinship studies, especially in the initial evolutionary study, the starting point of the kinship diagram, from where we start making a reference to the entire genealogical chart, has been referred as an ego. So if we see, look into this diagram, there is a triangle which is for the father, a circle which is for the mother, and down there is a triangle. So between the two triangle, one line is drawn, which is the line of descent, and then a line comes downward. So between the ego and the S, these are basically sibling, that is the son and the daughter. So this is a very simple diagram, represent a family, elementary family with father, mother, the ego and the son. Now there's a lot of question as to why the ego is male, but then there was a kind of an androcentric bias towards the emergence and the way in which anthropology started kinship, that most of the time the ego was considered to be representing a male member in the genealogical chart. Now after these diagrams and abbreviation, what is very important to understand, and this again I take kind of recap into the previous lecture, where I talked about two kinds of kinship terminology, and in terms of descriptive and classificatory. Descriptive terminology trying to use separate word for the lineal and the collateral relatives, and here in terms of the classificatory, there is a huge number of individuals who are clubbed together, and there are several principles on which classifications is done. First is generation. When we look into the generation, we see generation means all individual in the same age group. So in a genealogical chart, there could be an ego, which is ego's generation. So ego's sibling, the brother and the sister. The preceding generation of the ego would be the father, and then you have an alternate generation which is between the grandfather and the grandchildren. So many a time in classification is done in which the ego, the grandfather and the grandchild, which is an alternate generations, are clubbed together. The next is the gender. Gender is a very clear line of descent, is a patrilineal line, then the classification is done accordingly. So father's brother would be different from mother's brother. So there is a classification based on the gender of father and the mother. Then the third classification is on lineality versus collaterality. So lineality as a term means that there is in a one straight line, that is all your lineal relatives are those who are directly related through blood. So father, father's father and the father's father would be a lineal relative, whereas all those who are related through the lineal relatives are the collateral. Then we also have another term which is consanguinal versus a final king. The fourth is relative age of individual, which is used for classification. The next is sex of connecting relative, and other which are of less significance are social conditions and side of the family. As I go through the lectures, I will clarify on these principles in more elaborate manner. The next term which is very important, which we saw in the previous slide also, is the concept of consanguinity. Now consanguinity or consanguinal is the consanguinal is used to refer to the relatives. It refers to relations based on blood, that is the relation between parent and sibling and between siblings. So who are consanguines in our family is the father and mother, plus the sister or the brother in the elementary family are the consanguinal relations. But if we keep in Radcliffe Brown, he is considered as one of the founding figures in the study of kinship studies, it is very important to understand that the kinship relation is not only kind of biological or physical, it is also social. That is, it is legitimacy by the people becomes very significant when we try to understand the blood relation. In this, he gives us the example of adopted children. So the adopted child need not necessarily have a blood tie with the father, but since he is kind of a son, therefore he is a consanguinal relation. Difference between genitor and physical genitor, which is the physical or biological father, and the pater, which is the social father. Now, social father is determined by marriage. Now, we will see in the course of the lectures that among the Nair, they do not have the customary practices of kind of fatherhood, because it's a matrilineal society. In this, the father who is kind of a social father is established through a ritual. So, there could be a difference in term of the genitor and the pater, but it is the pater who is socially recognized as the father of the child, who has given certain amount of gift to the women at the time of the delivery of the child. So, this distinction is very important to keep in mind, that descent does not always mean the physical blood relation, but it can also be a social relation. The kind of opposite or kind of a related term to consanguine is affinal or affines. Affine, as you know, means alliance. An alliance here in the kinship study refers to a relation developed through the basis of marriage. So, the husband-wife relation is an affinal relation. Similarly, the relation of a person with the in-laws are also an affinal relation. So, we have categorically two kind of a relation in a family, that is a consanguinal. The family in which we are born, we have a consanguinal relation, and the family to which we get married, we have a affinal relation. The word alliance is derived from French, where it can be used to describe marriage or the fact of being in-law relation. So, that makes us clear what is an affinal relation. The most basic relation that results from marriage is between husband and wife, and here when we draw in the coming lectures, I will be talking about the alliance approach to kinship. We will see the contribution of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who led the foundation of the study on kinship based on alliance. And according to Lévi-Strauss, it was alliance or circulation of women within the group or between groups that actually led to the establishment of social structure. For Lévi-Strauss, actually alliance becomes the basic principle, and to explain this, why kind of an alliance is required, he will go into the whole notion of incest, and incest he explains that is a biological relation between members of an elementary family. From incest taboo, he goes on to explain exogamy, the fact that we cannot marry within our own family, we need a partner outside the family. So, that leads to marriage outside one group is exogamy. And to explain this exogamy, he tells us the notion of that women has to move out of the group, and another woman has to come in as a wife to the brother. So, there is a kind of a circulation of women or exchange of women from one group to the other, which leads to the understanding of family and marriage. Then the next concept, which is very important, is agnetic or agnates. Agnetic, it pertains to the reckoning of relationship by male link exclusively, regardless of the sex of the ego, but we keep in mind that for the majority of the time the ego is a male. So, all male members traced in the line of one line of descent are considered as agnates. So, basically it is the line in a patrilineal society, it could be the ego, his father, father's father, all these male members would be considered as an agnate, and therefore an agnate is a person related by patrilineal descent. The Roman law agnati, where kin who trace the relationship by descent through males only form a common ancestor who were under an authority of a single pater families and who resided together. Related or rather kind of opposed term to agnatic is cognatics or cognates. Cognatic is other term for cognatic is bilateral. A bilateral kinsman or a kinswoman is the closest of all cognatic relations, that is between the children of the same father and mother. Actually, the distinction between agnate and cognate is that agnates are all male members in the patrilineal line of descent, whereas all cognates could be either male or female. Most of all cognatic relation is that between children of the same father or mother. Anthropologists use the term sibling to refer to this relationship. A male sibling is a brother and a female sibling is a sister. So, when we try to look into the agnate and cognate, we will get a more clear understanding when we go into the concept of descent and look into the types of descent. The next concept is lineal and collateral. I just explained lineal and collateral. To repeat, A lineal kin is a person who is related by direct line of descent, such as father, father's father, son and son's son. A collateral kin is a person who is related indirectly through the mediation of another relative, such as father's brother, father's sister, that is uncle, aunt, cousin, etc. So, one side you have a lineal relative, all those who are related through the father's line of descent, and then the second are those who are related through the lineal relatives becomes a collateral. Descent of lineal kins are called collateral kins. FB is father's brother is a lineal and father's brother's son is a collateral. So, that is the linkage between lineal and collateral. Now, very important concept in kinship study is the concept of descent. A descent is a relationship defined by connecting to an ancestor or ancestress through a culturally recognized sequence of parent-child link. To simplify it, a descent is a line of connection between an ancestor and his offspring. For instance, is a kind of a linkage in terms of the relation that can be set between father's fathers and the son is a line of descent. The basic function of descent is that enables to trace the relationship intergenerationally through real, putative and fictive parent-child link. So, here in the earlier traditional conventional kind of an understanding, there were two kind of a relation. One was the real kinship and the other was the fictive relation. So, real was those who could actually be traced down and whose relation was known, whereas the fictive, as the term tells us, were relations which were not known. They were kind of an understanding, yes, in the sense that so and so was a relative, but there is no clear cut kind of understanding who this relative were, and that is used kind of a fictive relation. So, when we look into descent, it refers to person's offspring or his parentage. So, we go both the side, and therefore, if we begin kind of ego as a reference point and move upward, we see ego, which is the son of the father, and then who is the son of father's father, and the line which is connecting the three of them is a line of descent. So, and in a very simple word, it helps us to trace one's ancestry. It kindly, if we kind of try to understand who was the ancestor, it can go up to 8 4-grandparents, and therefore, a kind of distinction can be made in terms of the lineage and clan. So, the whole idea is that it helps us to actually trace back our origin. Then when we look into descent, most of the anthropological theory tells us that there are different types of descent, and the first type is unilineal. As the term tells us, unilineal descent implies that there is a single line of ancestor, male or female. So, both male and female members of unilineal family, but descent are only recognized through relatives of one gender. To tell it in a more simple word is that unilineal descent, only one line is used to trace our ancestry. It is either a female line to trace ancestry or a male line to trace our ancestry, and depending on the gender of the line of the ancestry, we can have two kinds of unilineal descent, that is matrilineal descent and the patrilineal descent. So, basically there are two forms of descent, patrilineal descent and matrilineal descent. When we look into patrilineal descent, as the term says patri, which means from the father, though therefore it implies that the male line is being used to recognize the ancestry. In this, however, the common understanding is that only the male belongs to the father's descent. However, anthropological theory tells us that it is both male and female who belongs to their father kin group, but not their mother. However, when any time we see that after marriage, there is a kind of an understanding that the descent of the female changes, which is kind of a practice and not a theoretical understanding. only mates pass on their family identity to their children. So, it is very important to understand that line of descent is not only kind of recognizing genealogy or ancestry. In kind of a practical understanding, it helps us to determine the line of inheritance of property. So, if the father's line of is being used, therefore, the sons belongs to the father's lineage, and by that default he kind of becomes a owner. So, in Hindi we have this whole idea of karta, or the idea of co-parsonary, that is all male members by default have ownership in the father's property, is based on a patrilineal line of descent. Women children are member of a husband's patrilineal line. So, the real people however are related to each other in patrilineal, which need to keep in mind that it is the women who will change her line or residence, but her line of descent will continue to remain the same. The second form of unilineal descent is matrilineal descent. In matrilineal descent, the form of unilineal descents that follow a female line. That is to say, the female line is used to trace ancestry and pass down the property. Relative traces descend through females to the same female ancestor. So, here the tracing to the ancestry would end up into a female member. Both male and female children are members of their mother's matrilineal descent group. Daughters pass on the family line to their offspring. But what is very interesting among the matrilineal society is a concept which Audrey Richards has given us, and is to understand the position of male member in a matrilineal society, and this is kind of considered as a puzzle in contrast to what is happening in a patrilineal society. So, just to clarify, in a patrilineal society we see that the line of descent, the line of inheritance and ownership of property are all in the hand of a male member. So, it passes from father to the son. In contrast to this, in a matrilineal society, the ownership or the management of property does not pass from a woman to her daughter. It passes to the mother's brother or sister's son. So, that is the puzzle, that it should follow the female line, but it is not. So, the power and authority is always in the hand of a male member. Now, this whole idea of matrilineal puzzle, whether it is actually in the way it has been theorized, practiced in society, is subject to debates, and there are many anthropologists who kind of critiques this concept, but it is very important to understand how we can also relate descent, line of descent, to power and authority. So, in a patrilineal society, we see it is a patriarchal society. That is, it is the since the line of inheritance, power and property is in male hand, it is the male who rules. So, it is the rule of the father. Whereas, in a matrilineal society, the kind of a matriarchal society is absent or becomes illusionary, because the power does not rest all the time in the female hand. So, that is a contrast between the patrilineal and the matrilineal society. So, when we try to understand the next form of descent after unilineal descent is double descent. Now, double descent refers to descent through both patrilineal and matrilineal group with attendant rights and obligations, but assigns to each a different set of expectations. So, that is both the line, that is the female and the male line, are used for recognition of line of ancestry, inheritance and kind of distribution of power and authority, and both the line becomes significant at the same time, as though there is no distinction between the patrilineal and the matrilineal. So, the whole example of the inheritance of immovable practice such as land may be the domain of the patrilineage, and while the matrilineage controls the inheritance of movable objects such as livestock. This is an example from Yako, which was studied by Dariel Ford, and Dariel Ford tells us that this is a concept of kind of a society which has two unilineal descent group, but he termed it as a double descent in the sense that both the patri clan and the matri clan coexist at the same time, though they function or the purpose for which the two clan exist is for different purpose. So, if we look into kind of Leach understanding of the double descent, he would say that it is a kind of an ambiguous concept, because there is nothing called double descent, it is only kind of a two unilineal descent group. So, that helps us to kind of understand the concept of double descent. The third type of descent is cognatic. As we just done about the concept of cognatic, that is either male or female. Line of descent is used to kind of recognize ancestry and the father's line, but it is kind of bilateral. There is no significance given to one over the other. And the example of cognatic is the Iban of Borneo. The fourth type of descent is ambilineal. The patrilineal and the matrilineal principle both operate in the societal level, but at the level of individual, various rules of choice define a person as belonging to either mother or father. There is no clarity in terms of which line of ancestry is going to be followed, and because there is no clarity, there is kind of both are having equal so the term ambilineal is used. So, with this I come to an end to the first part of the lecture. Thank you.